On November 7th, 1974, 31-year-old Barbara Mabee Abel opened the door of her West Palm Beach, Florida, home to find a handsome, clean-cut man standing on her doorstep with a gun pointed at her chest, telling her calmly and almost apologetically that he needed a place to hide for a few hours, and that if she cooperated, he wouldn't hurt her or her young son Dale, or her twin sister Beverly, who had cerebral palsy and lived with them. Barbara, terrified but trying to stay calm for her family's safety, let the stranger inside, having no idea that she had just admitted Paul John Knowles, a serial killer who had murdered at least 18 people across 8 states in just 4 months, into her home, and that she was about to become one of the very few people to spend extended time with the man the media had dubbed the Casanova Killer, and survived to tell about it. Before we continue with this disturbing case, please subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support is what allows us to continue bringing these important stories to light. What made Paul John Knowles particularly terrifying was not just the number of people he killed, or the brutal methods he used, strangling, shooting, stabbing, beating, but the complete randomness of his victim selection and the charm he used to gain access to them. Unlike serial killers who have specific types of victims or particular patterns, Knowles killed whoever crossed his path at the moment he needed a car, money, or simply felt the urge to kill. His victims range from elderly women living alone to young children, to middle-aged businessmen, to teenage girls, spanning ages from 7 to 65, with no demographic pattern that would help law enforcement predict his next move. He used his striking good looks, 6 feet tall, athletic build, piercing blue eyes, and dark hair worn in the fashionable style of the early 1970s, to charm his way into people's homes and lives, presenting himself as a friendly stranger who needed help, a hitchhiker looking for a ride, or a handyman offering services. By the time his victims realized they were in danger, it was too late. Knowles had already gained their trust, isolated them, and was ready to kill without hesitation or remorse. The story of Paul John Knowles begins not with his murder spree in 1974, but decades earlier in Orlando, Florida, where he was born on April 17, 1946, to Thomas Jefferson Knowles and Bonnie Strickland. His childhood was marked by abandonment, neglect, and instability that would shape the violent predator he would become. Thomas Knowles was largely absent from his son's life, and when he was present, he was abusive and violent toward both Paul's mother Bonnie and the children. Bonnie struggled with her own demons, unable to provide consistent care for Paul and his siblings, and by the time Paul was 7 years old, he had been removed from his mother's care and placed into Florida's foster care system. Paul bounced between multiple foster homes throughout his childhood, each placement representing another rejection, another confirmation in young Paul's mind that he was unwanted, unloved, and disposable. Child psychologists who would later examine his case noted that this pattern of abandonment created in Paul a desperate need for approval and affection, combined with a deep-seated rage toward those who rejected him, particularly women, who represented in his mind the mother who had failed to protect him and the foster mothers who had sent him away. By age 10, Paul was already exhibiting the warning signs that criminologists now recognize as predictors of serial violence. He was cruel to animals, torturing small creatures he captured and setting fire to a neighbor's cat, in an incident that horrified his foster family. He was a chronic liar, fabricating elaborate stories about his family, his accomplishments, and his life, creating fictional realities that were more acceptable to him than the truth of his abandonment and rejection. And he was a thief, stealing from foster parents, from schools, from neighbors, not always out of need, but for the thrill of taking what belonged to others and the sense of power it gave him over those he stole from. Paul's first arrest came at age 12 for petty theft, and it would be the first of many. Throughout his teenage years, Paul cycled in and out of juvenile detention facilities, reform schools, and youth correctional programs across Florida. None of them worked. None of them addressed the underlying psychological damage that had been done by his childhood trauma. Paul had learned that the world was a hostile place where you took what you wanted before someone took it from you, and he had learned that his charm, his good looks, and his ability to lie convincingly could get him out of most situations. By his late teens, Paul John Knowles had developed into a strikingly handsome young man who turned heads wherever he went. Women were drawn to him immediately, attracted by his good looks and his seemingly genuine interest in them, the way he listened intently when they spoke and made them feel special and seen. Paul had discovered that his appearance was a weapon, a tool he could use to manipulate, to gain trust, and to get what he wanted, whether that was money, a place to stay, sex, or simply the satisfaction of controlling another person. But beneath the charming exterior was a violent, impulsive man with no moral compass and no capacity for genuine empathy. Paul saw other people not as human beings with their own lives and feelings, but as objects to be used for his benefit and discarded when they no longer served a purpose. In 1965, at age 19, Paul was arrested for armed robbery in Jacksonville, Florida, after holding up a convenience store with a gun and taking less than $100 while terrifying the clerk. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison at Florida State Prison, his first adult conviction, and it would be the beginning of a pattern that would define the next decade of his life. Crime, imprisonment, release, more crime, more imprisonment, in an endless cycle that demonstrated the complete failure of the criminal justice system to rehabilitate someone like Paul John Knowles. Paul served his time at Florida State Prison, where he was a model prisoner by all appearances, participating in educational programs, working prison jobs, and convincing counselors and parole boards that he had reformed, that he had learned his lesson, that he was ready to become a productive member of society. It was all an act, a performance designed to secure his release, because prison didn't rehabilitate Paul John Knowles. It simply taught him to be better at hiding who he really was and what he was capable of. Paul was released on parole in 1968 after serving just over 2 years, and within months he was arrested again, this time for breaking and entering. He was sent back to prison, released in 1970, arrested again in 1971 for burglary, back to prison, released in 1972, arrested for assault, back to prison again. The cycle continued, each time Paul convincing parole boards that he had changed, that this time would be different, each time proving within weeks or months that he had not changed at all, and likely never would. But during his various periods of freedom between incarcerations, Paul developed a pattern that would later characterize his murder spree. He would target women, particularly women who were alone, vulnerable, or seeking companionship. He would use his charm and good looks to gain their trust, presenting himself as a nice guy who was down on his luck and just needed a break. And once he had access to them, he would rob them, often violently, taking their money, their valuables, and their sense of safety. What's crucial to understand about Paul John Knowles during these years is that he wasn't yet a murderer, at least not one that authorities knew about. He was a violent criminal, yes, A predator who targeted vulnerable women, certainly, but the violence was usually a means to an end. Robbery, assault, intimidation. The killing, when it came in 1974, would be something different, something that seemed to fulfill a need in Paul that went beyond material gain, something that suggested he derived pleasure not just from robbing his victims, but from the act of taking their lives and having complete power over them in their final moments. In 1972, while serving another sentence at Florida State Prison, Paul met a woman named Angela Covic through a prison pen pal program that connected prisoners with civilians who wanted to correspond with inmates. Angela lived in San Francisco and was drawn to the idea of corresponding with a prisoner, perhaps seeing herself as someone who could help rehabilitate a troubled man who had made mistakes but deserved a second chance. Over months of letters, Paul worked his charm on Angela from behind bars, presenting himself as a misunderstood man who had made mistakes in his youth, but was ready to change his life and become the person he knew he could be. The letters Paul wrote to Angela were eloquent, thoughtful, filled with remorse for his past crimes and dreams for a better future, where he could have a normal life, a family, stability, all the things he had never had as a child. Angela fell in love with the man in the letters, this intelligent, sensitive soul who just needed someone to believe in him, and she began visiting Paul in prison, making the long trip from California to Florida multiple times to see the man she was falling in love with. Eventually, Angela agreed to marry Paul, telling him that when he was released on parole, she would help him start a new life in California, away from Florida and all his old patterns and the criminal environment that had trapped him in a cycle of arrest and imprisonment. She would help him find work, build a stable home, be the family he had never had, give him the unconditional love and acceptance that would allow him to finally become the person he was meant to be. For Paul, Angela represented everything he thought he wanted: acceptance, stability, a woman who saw value in him despite his criminal past and his years in prison. She was his chance at a normal life, his opportunity to leave his criminal past behind and build something legitimate and real. Or at least, that's what he told himself, and what he told Angela in his letters. In reality, Paul John Knowles was incapable of the kind of emotional connection and commitment that a real relationship requires, incapable of seeing another person as anything more than a means to an end, incapable of genuine love or empathy or any of the emotions that make us human. But he didn't know that yet, or perhaps he did know it, but believed that Angela could somehow fix him, could somehow fill the void inside him that had been created by his childhood trauma and years of rejection and abandonment. Paul was released on parole in May 1974, after serving 2 years of his latest sentence for burglary. He was 28 years old, had spent more than a decade of his adult life in prison, and was being given what he believed was his last chance at redemption and a normal life. The parole conditions were clear and non-negotiable. Paul was to travel directly to San Francisco, marry Angela Covic as planned, find legitimate employment, and report regularly to a California parole officer who would monitor his progress and ensure he was complying with all conditions of his release. Any violation of these conditions, any arrest, any failure to report, any indication he was returning to his old criminal patterns, would send him back to prison immediately, and given his extensive criminal history, it would likely be for a very long time. Paul flew to San Francisco in early May 1974, excited to finally meet Angela in person after 2 years of letters and prison visits, excited to begin his new life in California, excited to prove that he could be more than just a career criminal cycling in and out of prison. But when Paul arrived at Angela's apartment in San Francisco, something had changed. Angela had been consulting with a psychic advisor, a practice she had been exploring in the months leading up to Paul's release, and the psychic had given her a warning that deeply unsettled her. The psychic told Angela that a dangerous man was coming into her life, that he would bring violence and tragedy, that she needed to be very careful about who she let into her world. The psychic's warnings, combined with Angela's own growing doubts about marrying a man she'd only known through letters and brief prison visits, led her to a decision that would change everything and set in motion a chain of events that would leave at least 18 people dead across 8 states in just 4 months. When Paul arrived at her apartment eager to finalize their wedding plans and begin their life together, Angela told him she couldn't marry him, at least not right away. She said she needed more time to think, that they should get to know each other better before making such a serious commitment, that he should find his own place to live, and they could date for a while and see how things went before rushing into marriage. To Paul, this was complete rejection and betrayal. After everything he had sacrificed, after all his hopes and plans for a new life, after believing that Angela would be his salvation and give him the stability and acceptance he had never had, she was abandoning him just like everyone else in his life had done. His father, his mother, his foster families, every woman who had ever claimed to care about him. What happened next remains somewhat unclear because Paul John Knowles gave conflicting accounts of his actions in the days following Angela's rejection. In some versions of his eventual confession to authorities, Paul claimed he left Angela's apartment calmly and spent a few days trying to process the rejection and figure out what to do next. In other versions, he claimed he immediately flew into a rage and did something violent, though he was always vague about the details. What is clear from investigators who later pieced together the timeline is that sometime in mid-May 1974, probably within days of Angela rejecting him, Paul John Knowles killed for the first time, or at least for the first time that authorities would later be able to confirm through forensic evidence and victim identification. According to Paul's eventual confession recorded on a tape he would make months later, on the night Angela rejected him or shortly thereafter, he drove around San Francisco in a fugue state, consumed by rage and a need to hurt someone the way he had been hurt. He claimed he encountered 3 random people that night in different parts of San Francisco and killed all 3 of them, though he was always vague about the details and could never provide enough specific information for police to identify these supposed victims or even confirm they existed. Whether these 3 San Francisco murders actually occurred remains unknown to this day. What is certain from confirmed evidence and documented cases is that by late May 1974, Paul had violated his parole by not reporting to his California parole officer as required, had left California entirely without permission, and had returned to Florida, specifically to Jacksonville, the city where he had spent so much of his criminal career and where he knew the streets, the neighborhoods, and the patterns of law enforcement. On July 26, 1974, Paul got into a fight at a bar in Jacksonville over something trivial. When the bartender tried to intervene and break up the altercation, Paul stabbed him with a knife he was carrying and fled the scene before police arrived. The bartender survived the stabbing, was treated at a local hospital, and gave police a description of his attacker. Police issued a warrant for Paul's arrest on charges of aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, and when officers went to the apartment where Paul had been staying to arrest him, they found evidence suggesting he had been casing homes in wealthy neighborhoods, planning robberies, making notes about which houses appeared to have elderly residents living alone and which ones had valuables visible through windows. Paul was arrested on July 26th and held in the Duval County Jail, awaiting arraignment on the assault charges. This should have been the end of Paul John Knowles' criminal career. He was facing serious felony charges for the stabbing, had violated his parole by leaving California and failing to report to his parole officer, and would almost certainly be sent back to prison for a significant sentence that would keep him off the streets for years. But on July 27th, just one day after his arrest and less than 24 hours after being placed in his detention cell at Duval County Jail, Paul managed to escape from custody. The exact method of his escape remains somewhat unclear even today. Some reports suggest he picked the lock on his cell using a makeshift tool he had fashioned from materials available in the cell, while other reports suggest he received help from a corrupt guard who was bribed or intimidated into leaving the cell door unlocked. Regardless of how it happened, Paul John Knowles was now a fugitive from justice with outstanding warrants for his arrest, and perhaps most significantly, he had nothing left to lose. He had no home, no money, no prospects for a legitimate life, no woman waiting for him, no future except prison or death. This combination of factors, freedom, desperation, rage at the world that had rejected him, and nothing to lose, created the perfect conditions for what would become one of the most random and terrifying murder sprees in American history. On August 2nd, 1974, just 6 days after escaping from the Duval County Jail, Paul John Knowles committed his first confirmed murder that investigators would later be able to definitively link to him through forensic evidence. Her name was Alice Curtis, a 65-year-old retired schoolteacher living alone in a modest home in Jacksonville, Florida. Paul broke into her home in the middle of the night, moving through her house quietly, ransacking rooms looking for cash, jewelry, and other valuables he could sell or pawn. Alice woke up when she heard noises downstairs and made the fatal mistake of going to investigate rather than locking her bedroom door and calling police. When Alice confronted Paul in her living room, demanding to know who he was and what he was doing in her home, Paul strangled her to death with his hands, squeezing her throat until she stopped struggling and her body went limp. He left Alice's body on the floor of her bedroom and continued searching the house, taking whatever items of value he could find: cash from her purse, jewelry from her dresser, a small television. He then stole Alice's car, an older model sedan that was parked in her driveway, and drove away from the scene, abandoning his stolen vehicle nearby and using Alice's car to leave Jacksonville and begin traveling north through Georgia. The murder of Alice Curtis marked the beginning of a killing spree that would terrorize multiple states over the next 4 months and leave at least 18 people dead, though Paul would later claim the number was much higher, perhaps 30 or even 35 victims, though investigators could never confirm many of the additional murders he claimed to have committed. What made Paul John Knowles particularly dangerous and difficult for law enforcement to track was his complete randomness. Unlike many serial killers who have a specific type of victim they target, young women with long dark hair parted in the middle like Ted Bundy, or young men and boys like John Wayne Gacy, Paul killed whoever crossed his path at the moment he needed something or simply felt the urge to kill. His victims included elderly women living alone, middle-aged businessmen, young mothers, teenagers, even a 7-year-old child, men, women, children, elderly people. If Paul encountered them and perceived them as either a threat to his freedom, or an opportunity for robbery, or simply someone he could kill, He killed them without hesitation, without remorse, without any recognition that they were human beings with families and lives and futures. Just one day after murdering Alice Curtis, on August 3rd, 1974, Paul broke into the home of 49-year-old Marjorie Howe in Atlantic Beach, Florida, a coastal community just outside Jacksonville. Like Alice Curtis, Marjorie lived alone in a modest home and was surprised by an intruder in the middle of the night when she woke to the sound of someone moving through her house. Paul strangled Marjorie with his hands in the same manner he had killed Alice Curtis the night before, then ransacked her home, stealing money, jewelry, and other valuables before using Marjorie's car to flee the scene and abandoning Alice Curtis's stolen vehicle nearby. The pattern was now established. Paul would break into homes, usually at night, usually targeting people who lived alone and appeared vulnerable. If they surprised him or resisted, or simply were in the wrong place at the wrong time, he killed them. He would steal vehicles and valuables, use them for a few days or weeks as he traveled from state to state, then abandon them when he moved on to his next victim, creating a trail of stolen cars and murdered victims that stretched across the southeastern United States. On August 23, 1974, Paul broke into a home in Musella, Georgia, where he encountered 24-year-old Kathy Sue Pierce, a young mother whose 3-year-old son was asleep in another room of the house. Paul strangled Kathy with a telephone cord, killing her in her own home while her child slept just feet away. He then robbed the house, taking whatever items of value he could find and stealing Kathy's car. In what might have been a rare moment of mercy or might have been simple indifference, Paul left the 3-year-old boy unharmed and sleeping in his bed. The child woke hours later in the morning and found his mother's body, a trauma that would affect him for the rest of his life. Throughout late August and into September 1974, Paul continued his rampage, traveling through Georgia, Florida, Alabama, and northward into Ohio, breaking into homes, stealing vehicles, and killing anyone who got in his way or who he perceived as a threat or opportunity. On September 3rd, 1974, in what would become one of his most disturbing crimes, Paul abducted a 7-year-old girl from a campground in Lima, Ohio. The girl had been playing near her family's campsite when Paul approached her, likely presenting himself as a friendly adult who needed help finding something or offering to show her something interesting. The girl's body was never found, and Paul refused to tell authorities what he did with her when he was eventually captured, claiming he couldn't remember the details or where he had disposed of her remains. Her disappearance remains officially unsolved to this day, though investigators are certain Paul killed her based on his confession and his presence in Lima, Ohio, at the exact time she vanished. On September 18, 1974, Paul encountered Carswell Carr, a wealthy businessman from Macon, Georgia, and his 15-year-old daughter Amanda at a location where Paul had been hitchhiking, or where Carswell had stopped to help what appeared to be a stranded motorist. Paul kidnapped both Carswell and Amanda at gunpoint, forced Carswell to drive to a secluded wooded area outside Milledgeville, Georgia, then shot them both in the head execution style with a handgun he had stolen during one of his earlier burglaries. He stole Carswell's car, a late-model luxury vehicle, and left the bodies in the woods where they wouldn't be discovered for several days. By early October 1974, law enforcement agencies across multiple states, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Ohio, Virginia, Connecticut, had begun to realize they were dealing with a serial killer who seemed to be moving constantly across state lines, never staying in one place long enough to establish a pattern that investigators could track. The FBI was called in to coordinate between different jurisdictions and establish a task force to track the killer, who was leaving a trail of bodies and stolen vehicles across the southeastern and mid-Atlantic United States. The media began covering the story extensively, and Paul John Knowles started to earn his nickname in newspaper headlines, the Casanova Killer, so named because of his good looks, his ability to charm his way into people's homes and lives before murdering them, and his pattern of targeting women who let him into their homes because he appeared harmless and friendly and in need of help. One of the most chilling aspects of Paul John Knowles' murder spree was his desire to be remembered, to be famous, to go down in history as one of the greatest serial killers America had ever seen. During one of his burglaries in October 1974, Paul stole a portable tape recorder, the kind that was common in the 1970s with cassette tapes and a built-in microphone. He began using this tape recorder to create what would become known as the confession tape, a rambling, detailed, several-hour-long recording in which Paul described his crimes, his thoughts, his motivations, his justifications for the murders he had committed. In the recordings which Paul made while driving between murders or while hiding out in abandoned buildings or stolen vehicles, Paul described in graphic detail how he had killed his victims, where the murders occurred, what method he used to kill them, what he stole from them afterward, how their bodies had looked when they died. His voice on the tape is calm, almost conversational, as if he's discussing a series of ordinary events rather than brutal murders of innocent people. The tape recordings reveal Paul's psychology in disturbing detail. He shows no remorse, no recognition that he has done anything wrong, no empathy for his victims or their families. Instead, he talks about the victims as if they were obstacles that needed to be removed, problems that needed to be solved, objects that served a purpose and were then discarded when they were no longer useful to him. "I killed her because she saw my face," Paul says in one portion of the tape, referring to an elderly woman whose home he had burglarized. "I couldn't leave witnesses behind. I'm not stupid. I know how this works. You can't leave people alive who can identify you to police." In another section of the tape, he describes strangling a victim with chilling detachment. "It's easier than you would think. You just squeeze and after a while they stop fighting. Their face turns blue and then purple and then they just stop moving. It's almost peaceful in a way, watching the life drain out of someone." The tape also reveals Paul's obsession with Angela Covic, the woman whose rejection he blamed for triggering his murder spree. In multiple sections of the recording, Paul talks about Angela, about how she had promised him everything: love, acceptance, a new life, a chance to be normal, and then took it all away when he arrived in San Francisco, ready to start their life together. "She made me what I am," Paul says on the tape, his voice filled with anger and bitterness. "She promised me everything, and then she took it all away. Every person I've killed since then is because of her. She needs to know that. She needs to understand what she did to me, what she made me become. If she had just kept her promise, if she had just married me like she said she would, none of this would have happened. All these people would still be alive." This delusional thinking, blaming Angela for his own choices, refusing to accept responsibility for his actions, seeing himself as the victim rather than the perpetrator, is characteristic of antisocial personality disorder and the narcissistic mindset that allows serial killers to justify their crimes. Paul genuinely seemed to believe that he was the victim in this scenario, that the murders were something that had been done to him rather than by him, that he bore no responsibility for choosing to kill nearly 20 people over 4 months. Paul gave the confession tape to a lawyer named Sheldon Yavitz, whom he contacted from Florida. asking Yavitz to hold the tape and, if anything happened to Paul, to release it to the public and ensure the proceeds from its sale went to Paul's mother, Bonnie Knowles. Paul wanted his crimes to be famous, wanted to be remembered as one of the greatest serial killers in American history, wanted his name to be spoken in the same breath as other notorious killers. The tape was his insurance policy, his guarantee that even if he was caught or killed, his story would be told and he would achieve the fame and notoriety he craved. By November 1974, Paul John Knowles had been on the run for over 4 months since his escape from the Duval County Jail, and he was exhausted, running low on money, and increasingly paranoid that law enforcement was closing in on him. He had abandoned his pattern of constantly moving between states and had stayed in the Atlanta, Georgia area for several days, a decision that would prove to be a fatal mistake because staying in one place too long gave investigators time to track stolen vehicles and identify patterns in his movements. On November 7, 1974, Paul drove to West Palm Beach, Florida, and broke into the home of Barbara Mabee Abel, a 31-year-old single mother. Inside the house were Barbara, her young son Dale, and her twin sister Beverly, who had cerebral palsy and required constant care. Barbara was alone in the living room when Paul entered through an unlocked door with a gun in his hand. "Don't scream," Paul told her, his voice calm and almost polite. "I'm not going to hurt you if you cooperate. I just need a place to stay for a few hours, and then I'll be gone. I won't hurt you or your family." Barbara, terrified but trying to stay calm for the sake of her son and sister in the other rooms, agreed to let Paul stay. He made himself comfortable in her home, helped himself to food from her refrigerator, even struck up what seemed like a friendly conversation with Barbara, expressing regret about needing to intrude on her home and explaining that he was running from some trouble and just needed to lay low for a while until things cooled down. He was charming, polite, seemingly genuinely apologetic about the inconvenience he was causing her, and if Barbara hadn't seen the gun tucked into his waistband, she might have believed he was just a troubled young man who had gotten mixed up in something and needed help. After several hours at Barbara's home, during which Paul ate, rested, and talked with Barbara about his life and his troubles, without mentioning the murders, Paul told Barbara he needed her to drive him somewhere. He promised that once she dropped him off at his destination, she would never see him again and could return home safely to her family. Barbara, hoping desperately that cooperating would end this ordeal without anyone getting hurt, agreed. She made arrangements for her son Dale and her sister Beverly to be cared for by a neighbor, then got into her car with Paul John Knowles sitting in the passenger seat with his gun resting on his lap, not knowing she was now a hostage of one of America's most wanted fugitives, not knowing that the man beside her had killed at least 17 people in the past 4 months, not knowing that she was one of the very few people who would spend significant time with Paul John Knowles and survive. They drove for hours, with Paul constantly changing directions, telling Barbara to take this highway, then that back road, then double back and go a different direction. He was paranoid, certain that police were looking for him, checking every car they passed to see if it might be law enforcement following them. During the long drive through Florida and into Georgia, Paul talked extensively with Barbara. He told her about his life, his time in prison, the woman named Angela who had rejected him and broken his heart. He didn't tell Barbara directly about the murders, but he hinted at dark things in his past, referring to himself as not a good person and someone who has done bad things that I can't take back. Barbara realized with growing horror that she wasn't just dealing with a simple criminal on the run from a robbery or assault charge. There was something deeply wrong with the man beside her, something broken and dangerous that went far beyond ordinary criminality. At one point during their journey, they stopped for gas at a rural station in southern Georgia. Paul went inside to pay for the gas, and Barbara briefly considered running away or trying to signal for help to the gas station attendant. But she looked at the gun Paul had left on the seat beside her, thought about her son Dale and her sister Beverly waiting at home for her to return, and decided that cooperating was still her best chance of survival. If she tried to run and Paul caught her, he would almost certainly kill her. If she tried to signal for help and the signal was intercepted by Paul, he would kill her and probably kill whoever she tried to signal to as well. So Barbara sat in the car, waited for Paul to return from paying for the gas, and continued driving wherever he told her to go, hoping for an opportunity to escape safely, praying that someone would see them and realize something was wrong. They drove through the night of November 7th into the early morning hours of November 8th, with Paul eventually falling asleep in the passenger seat, giving Barbara her first real opportunity to escape. The roads were dark and empty. They were in a rural area Barbara didn't recognize, and she had no idea where they were or which direction would lead to help. She briefly considered pulling over, jumping out of the car, and running into the woods. But she knew Paul would wake up immediately when the car stopped moving, and she would be running blindly through unfamiliar woods in the dark, while Paul chased her with a gun. So Barbara kept driving, letting Paul sleep, hoping that when morning came, there would be more traffic on the roads and more opportunities for rescue. The opportunity came on the morning of November 8th, 1974, when Paul woke up and directed Barbara to drive to the home of a man named James Meyer in Perry, Florida. Meyer was a businessman who Paul had briefly met several weeks earlier during one of his burglaries or encounters, and Paul thought Meyer might be willing to help him by providing money or a different vehicle or a place to hide. When they arrived at Meyer's house in the early morning, Paul forced Barbara to come inside with him, using her as leverage to ensure Meyer's cooperation and to prevent Meyer from calling police the moment Paul appeared at his door. Paul told Meyer he was in serious trouble, that he needed money and a different vehicle to get out of Florida, and that he would hurt Barbara if Meyer didn't cooperate. Meyer, seeing that Paul was armed and desperate and had an innocent hostage, tried to stall for time, claiming he needed to go to his bank to withdraw cash, that his car keys were at his office downtown. Anything to delay and give him time to think of a plan or alert authorities. But Paul became increasingly agitated and paranoid as the morning progressed. He paced Meyer's house, looked out the windows constantly checking for police, and snapped at both Barbara and Meyer when they spoke or moved in ways he didn't like. Finally, Paul made a decision. He would take Meyer hostage as well, forcing Meyer to drive them all to the bank, where Meyer could withdraw money. Then they would take Meyer's car and continue fleeing northward. They all got into Meyer's car with Paul sitting in the back seat, holding his gun on both Barbara and Meyer. Barbara, in the front passenger seat, exhausted and terrified after nearly 24 hours as Paul's hostage, and Meyer driving and desperately trying to think of a way to save both himself and Barbara from this increasingly desperate and dangerous criminal. They had driven less than 2 miles from Meyer's house when they encountered a police roadblock that would change everything. Florida Highway Patrol had set up random checkpoints throughout the Perry area because there had been a reported sighting of Paul John Knowles in the vicinity the previous day, a tip from someone who thought they recognized the fugitive whose photograph had been circulating in newspapers and on television for weeks. Pure chance, simple random luck, had put this police roadblock directly in Paul's path at the exact moment he was traveling with 2 hostages in a stolen car. When Myers' car approached the roadblock and Paul saw the police vehicles and uniformed officers standing in the road ahead, he panicked. "Drive through it," Paul shouted at Meyer from the back seat, pressing his gun against the back of Myers' head. "Ram through the roadblock and don't stop." But Meyer, seeing an opportunity to save himself and Barbara and end this nightmare, did the opposite. He slammed on the brakes, bringing the car to a sudden screeching stop just feet from the roadblock, close enough that the police officers standing there immediately drew their weapons and began shouting commands. Police officers, seeing suspicious behavior from the vehicle that had just made an emergency stop at their roadblock, approached with weapons drawn and ordered everyone out of the vehicle with their hands visible. Paul, realizing his chance to escape peacefully through the roadblock was gone, made a split-second decision. He jumped from the back seat of Myers' car and ran toward the nearby woods, abandoning both hostages and fleeing on foot while multiple police officers shouted for him to stop and began pursuing him into the dense Florida underbrush. The chase through the woods outside Perry, Florida lasted nearly an hour on the morning of November 8, 1974. Paul was in good physical condition from his weeks on the run, and he knew that capture meant either the death penalty or life in prison for the multiple murders he had committed. He ran desperately through the swampy terrain, crashing through thick underbrush, crossing streams, climbing over fallen trees, trying desperately to put distance between himself and the dozens of officers who were pursuing him. But there were too many officers. They had police dogs tracking his scent, and most importantly, they knew the local terrain while Paul was running blindly through unfamiliar woods. The police dogs tracked Paul's scent through the swamp and woods for nearly an hour before catching up to him near a particularly dense area of palmetto bushes and brackish water. Paul John Knowles was finally tackled by 2 Florida Highway Patrol officers near a swamp approximately 3 miles from where he had fled Myers' car. He fought violently when the officers grabbed him, trying to reach a knife he had concealed in his pocket, screaming obscenities and threats at the officers, thrashing and kicking as they attempted to subdue him and get handcuffs on his wrists. It took 4 officers working together to finally restrain Paul and get him into handcuffs, and even then he continued struggling and threatening to kill the officers, screaming that they should just shoot him because he was never going back to prison, never going to let them lock him in a cage again. When officers searched Paul after securing him in handcuffs, they found a loaded handgun tucked into his waistband, a hunting knife in his pocket, identification documents belonging to multiple people, including some of his victims, jewelry that was later traced to several of the women he had murdered, and a small notebook containing what appeared to be notes about potential victims and locations he had scouted for future burglaries. Barbara Mabee Abel was finally free after nearly 24 hours as a hostage of the Casanova Killer. She was taken to a hospital to be examined and treated for shock and exhaustion, then interviewed extensively by FBI agents and local detectives about her ordeal. Years later, in interviews about her experience, Barbara would describe those 24 hours with Paul as like being trapped with a wild animal that could turn on you at any moment without warning. He seemed normal most of the time, charming even, having regular conversations and acting like we were just 2 people on a road trip together. But his eyes were completely empty. There was nothing human behind them. When he looked at me, it was like he was looking at an object, not a person. I knew if I made one wrong move, said one wrong thing, he would kill me without a second thought, the same way you would swat a fly that was bothering you. Paul John Knowles was held at the Columbia County Jail in Georgia, while prosecutors from multiple states, Florida, Georgia, Ohio, Virginia, Connecticut, fought over jurisdiction and who would try him first for murder. Each state wanted to prosecute Paul for the murders committed in their territory, and each state believed they had the strongest case and the best chance of securing a death penalty conviction. Florida prosecutors wanted to try him for the murders of Alice Curtis, Marjorie Howe, and others killed in Florida. Georgia prosecutors wanted to try him for the murders of Kathy Sue Pierce, Carswell Carr, Amanda Carr, and others killed in Georgia. The jurisdictional fight continued for weeks while Paul sat in jail, giving interviews to journalists, law enforcement officers, psychiatrists, and anyone else who would listen to him talk about his crimes. Paul was not content to simply accept his fate and wait quietly for trial. Within days of his arrest, he began giving extensive interviews in which he boasted about his crimes, claiming he had killed not 18 people, as investigators had confirmed, but 33 victims, or maybe 35. He couldn't quite remember the exact number, because there had been so many murders over such a short period of time. He described murders that police could never verify, claiming he had killed people in states where no corresponding missing persons reports or bodies were ever found. It was impossible for investigators to know if Paul was telling the truth about these additional murders, or if he was exaggerating his body count to enhance his notoriety and make himself seem more dangerous and important than he actually was. Some serial killers exaggerate their victim counts because they derive satisfaction from the fear and attention it brings them, and Paul John Knowles certainly seemed to be enjoying the spotlight and the media coverage his crimes were generating. Paul also reached out to his lawyer, Sheldon Yavitz, and instructed him to release the confession tape Paul had recorded during his murder spree. Paul wanted the world to know what he had done, wanted to be famous, wanted to be remembered as one of the most prolific and notorious serial killers in American history. The tape was transcribed by investigators, and portions of it were released to the media, shocking the American public with its cold, matter-of-fact descriptions of murder and its complete lack of remorse or human empathy. In one interview with a journalist, Paul was asked directly if he felt any remorse for his victims, if he ever thought about the lives he had taken and the families he had destroyed. "Remorse for what?" Paul replied, seeming genuinely confused by the question. "They were in my way. That's what happens when you're in someone's way. You get removed. It's natural selection. The strong survive and the weak don't. That's just how the world works." When asked specifically about Angela Covic, the woman whose rejection had allegedly triggered his murder spree, Paul became visibly agitated and angry. "She made me this way," he insisted, his voice rising. "I was ready to be a normal person. I was ready to have a life, to get married, to have a family, to do all the things normal people do. And she took that away from me. She promised me everything, and then she ripped it all away when I needed her most. Every person I killed is on her conscience, not mine. She needs to understand that. If she had just kept her promise, if she had just married me like she said she would, none of this would have happened. I would be living a normal life in California right now instead of sitting in this jail cell waiting to die." This delusional refusal to accept responsibility, this insistence that others were to blame for his own choices and actions, was consistent throughout all of Paul's confessions and interviews with law enforcement, psychiatrists, and journalists. He genuinely seemed to believe that he was a victim of circumstances beyond his control, that the murders were something that happened to him rather than something he actively chose to do, that he bore no moral responsibility for the deaths of nearly 20 people, because they were all ultimately caused by Angela's rejection and society's failure to give him the stability and love he needed as a child. Psychiatrists who evaluated Paul diagnosed him with antisocial personality disorder, also known as sociopathy or psychopathy, characterized by a complete lack of empathy, inability to form genuine emotional connections with others, tendency toward manipulation and deceit, and failure to conform to social norms or feel remorse for harmful actions. Prosecutors were preparing for what they expected to be one of the most high-profile murder trials in Georgia or Florida history. Depending on which state ultimately won the jurisdictional fight, the death penalty was virtually certain given the number of victims, the brutality of the crimes, and Paul's own detailed confessions both on tape and in interviews. There was no mitigating evidence that would justify sparing his life. No documented severe mental illness that would have prevented him from understanding his actions were wrong. No evidence of abuse so severe it would explain his behavior. No remorse or acceptance of responsibility that might convince a jury to show mercy. Paul John Knowles appeared to be exactly what prosecutors would argue he was, an irredeemable predator who killed without conscience and would kill again if ever given the opportunity. But the trial never happened. On December 18, 1974, just 40 days after his capture, and while awaiting trial, Paul John Knowles was being transported from Columbia County Jail in Georgia to a different facility. The transport was being conducted by Sheriff Earl Lee and Georgia Bureau of Investigation Agent Ronnie Angel. Standard procedure for moving high-risk prisoners between facilities. Paul was handcuffed and shackled, sitting in the back seat of an unmarked police car as they drove along rural Georgia roads toward his destination. According to the official report filed by the officers involved, Paul suddenly lunged forward without warning and attempted to grab Sheriff Lee's service weapon, which was holstered on Lee's belt. Sheriff Lee struggled with Paul, trying to maintain control of his weapon, while also trying to control the vehicle which was swerving dangerously as the struggle took place. Agent Ronnie Angel, sitting in the front passenger seat, drew his own weapon, turned in his seat, and fired 3 shots at close range, striking Paul in the chest. Paul John Knowles died almost instantly, slumping back in the seat of the car, blood spreading across his prison jumpsuit, his eyes open and staring at nothing. The man who had killed at least 18 people, and possibly as many as 35 over a 4-month period, who had terrorized 8 states and paralyzed communities with fear, who had wanted so desperately to be remembered as one of America's most notorious serial killers, died not in an execution chamber surrounded by witnesses and media coverage, not in a dramatic shootout with police, but in the back seat of an unmarked police car on a rural Georgia road, his body transported to a morgue and eventually buried in an unmarked grave because no family members claimed his remains. The death of Paul John Knowles ended the immediate threat he posed to public safety, but it left many questions unanswered that would haunt investigators and victims' families for decades to come. How many people had Paul really killed? Were the 30-plus murders he claimed real, or was he exaggerating to enhance his notoriety? What happened to some of the victims whose bodies were never found, like the 7-year-old girl who vanished from the Ohio campground? Where are their remains, and will their families ever get the closure of being able to bury them properly? And perhaps most frustratingly for those seeking justice, could Paul have been stopped earlier if the criminal justice system had worked differently? Investigation into Paul's background and criminal history revealed multiple points where the system had failed to prevent his murder spree. He had been arrested dozens of times throughout his life, starting in childhood, spending more time in custody than out of it. He had violated parole repeatedly, demonstrating again and again that he could not be trusted to follow rules or live peacefully in society. He had shown clear signs of dangerous escalation in his criminal behavior, progressing from petty theft as a child to armed robbery as a teenager to violent assault as a young adult. Yet somehow, despite all these red flags and all these opportunities for intervention, he had been released from prison again and again, given chance after chance by a parole system that seemed to believe he could be rehabilitated, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. If Paul had been kept in prison after his 1972 conviction, or if his parole had been revoked when he violated its conditions by leaving California in 1974, at least 18 people would still be alive today. The families of Paul's victims were left to grapple with unimaginable grief and unanswered questions. Alice Curtis's family mourned a kind, retired teacher who had dedicated her life to educating children and had been looking forward to a peaceful retirement. Marjorie Howe's relatives grieved a woman who had lived quietly and harmed no one, whose only mistake was living alone in a house that Paul decided to burglarize. Kathy Sue Pierce's 3-year-old son, who found his mother's body and would carry that trauma for the rest of his life, grew up without the mother who had loved him and protected him. The Carr family lost both a father and a teenage daughter in a single horrific attack, a double tragedy that shattered their family forever. And the family of the 7-year-old Ohio girl lived in tortured uncertainty, not knowing for certain what had happened to their daughter, unable to properly mourn without a body to bury, haunted by the possibility that she might still be alive somewhere, even though they knew in their hearts she was almost certainly dead. Angela Covic, the woman whose rejection Paul blamed for triggering his murder spree, lived with guilt and psychological trauma for years after Paul's death, even though she bore absolutely no responsibility for his choices or actions. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply decided not to marry a man she barely knew, exercising her fundamental right to make her own decisions about her life and her relationships. But Paul's accusations during his confession tape and in his interviews, his insistence that she had made him kill those people, haunted Angela and made her question whether she could have prevented the murders by just agreeing to marry him despite her doubts and fears. Psychologists who worked with Angela in the years after Paul's death helped her understand that Paul John Knowles alone was responsible for his actions, that no one made him kill those people, that his decision to murder was his choice alone and had nothing to do with her exercising her right to change her mind about marrying a convicted criminal she had only met through letters. Barbara Mabee Abel, the woman who survived 24 hours as Paul's hostage, struggled with post-traumatic stress disorder for years after her ordeal. She had nightmares about Paul, flashbacks to moments during their drive when she was certain he was about to kill her, anxiety attacks triggered by seeing men who resembled Paul, or being in situations where she felt trapped or unsafe. But Barbara eventually recovered with the help of therapy and the support of her family, married, raised her son Dale into a successful adult, and lived a full life. In interviews decades later, she described Paul as the most frightening person I have ever encountered, not because he was obviously dangerous or violent in appearance, but because he could seem so completely normal and charming. And then in an instant, you would see that emptiness in his eyes and realize you were in the presence of something that wasn't quite human anymore, if it ever had been. Paul's mother, Bonnie Knowles, the woman Paul claimed to adore and wanted to inherit the proceeds from his confession tape, was devastated by her son's crimes and by the public association with one of America's most notorious serial killers. She gave only one brief interview in 1975, shortly after Paul's death, in which she said, "I don't know what I did wrong. I tried to be a good mother. I tried to raise him.